Hi, I'm Brian Russell, and I want to use the book of Philippians to illustrate the importance of studying a book's structure as a means for pulling out the key insights and thoughts. Philippians has a key section built into it. We're going to look at here the middle section where Paul makes his main argument in his book. Again, by main, we're not suggesting that the other parts of Philippians aren't important, but the center of Paul's letter runs from 1:27 through 4:1. And in this, Paul lays out and describes the core message that he wants to make in the book of Philippians. If you look at Philippians chapter 1, verse 27, it reads this way: "Whatever happens, as citizens of heaven, live in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ." And there's a key word in here that illustrates a lot of the things that we've talked about as we've looked at the biblical narrative. We've talked a lot about learning to read Scripture missionally. And what I want you to see is Paul, the very language that Paul uses in Philippians helps to develop his missional message. And he does that by using language that's particularly relevant to Philippi. The city of Philippi was a Roman colony, which means that it had a higher proportion of Roman citizens in it. If you were a Roman citizen, you had certain kinds of rights that other persons didn't have. For example, you didn't have to pay taxes. You could appeal to the emperor. You had a higher status than most other persons in Rome. Again, remember in Roman days, 1 out of every 3 persons was a slave. Then there would have been free persons, and then up the ladder is the Roman citizen, and then higher up would be other types of authorities in Rome. So this was a real honor. So the church at Philippi was a wealthy church, and we can see that because the end of Paul's letter, essentially, once you get into chapter 4, Paul begins to do some takeaways, and the last part of his letter, the last 10 verses or so, Paul is essentially saying, "Thank you for your support. Please keep giving to me." So the Philippians were patrons of Paul, if you will. And Paul has a message for them, and it roots around the whole idea of citizenship. We just talked about how a high proportion of the Philippians were citizens. And in 127, I just read from you from the revised NIV, the TNIV, and it has the word citizens of heaven. That's not a bad translation, but what's interesting is the verb itself is a verb that really means be citizens. So Paul really says this one thing: continually be citizens worthy of Christ. So what does that mean? Be citizens worthy of the gospel. Well, Paul's going to illustrate that, and this is where the structure is important, because what happens in these next sections, 127 to 30, is essentially, and you'll see this when you have inductive Bible study, this is really the general statement that Paul is going to unpack in the coming verses. So this is a general statement. In other words, this is the general theme that Paul is going to develop. Be citizens worthy of Christ, be citizens worthy of the gospel. Now, to see that this citizenship theme is going to be important, you might know that Philippians 3:20 is going to have the noun form. This is a verb here in 127, but down in 3:20, Paul's going to use the phrase citizenship in heaven. And so what does that do? At the beginning of Paul's exhortation, he has this. Then towards the end, in 3:20, it falls right at the very end of chapter 3. Chapter 3 has a total of 21 verses, so this is right here at the end. And then Paul's going to wrap up his letters in 4:1, where he heaps up a lot of affectionate terminology for the Philippians. Look at 4:1 if you have your scriptures open. "Therefore, my brothers and sisters, whom I love and long for, my joy and my crown, stand firm in the Lord this way, my dear friends." And so he's definitely on friendly terms. So there's a lot of affection here. But notice that Paul ends with the final exhortation, stand firm. If we go ahead and look at 127 to 30, and if you have your scriptures open, have a look at that. Notice the second part of 127. This is just 127a that I put here. The second half of 127 says, then whether I come and see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you what? Stand firm. So you're starting to see a pattern, right? We have these elements, standing firm, standing firm. These key elements are beginning to recur that we have in here. So this suggests this whole argument, it fits together and is framed around the issues of standing firm and citizenship. So what happens in the middle? Well, Paul does three different points of focus. If you look at chapter 2 is well known for having what's known as the Christ hymn. The fancy word for it is Carmen Christi, but this is that embedded poetry, chapter 2, verses 6 to 11, that talks about who Jesus is, which captures a lot of attention. But notice essentially Paul's thought here runs from 2:1 all the way through 18. And what Paul does here is Paul focuses on Jesus and who Jesus is. And then Paul shifts to talk about Paul's co-workers. This is 2:19 through the end of chapter 2, verse 30. Paul talks about two of his co-workers, two men, Timothy and Epaphroditus. And then in chapter 3, Paul talks about himself. So notice what we end up having here then are three examples of what it looks like to be a citizen worthy of the gospel and how to stand firm. So Paul actually uses three different examples, including Jesus. So we have these three examples here. And this is a critical insight because sometimes this middle section just gets talked about as Paul talking about his travels or his co-workers, when in fact, this is central because a lot of the language that we see in these three sections is recurring language. In my book, Realigning with God, I have all of this laid out in the chapter that focuses on examples of missional reading, where I have the example of Jonah from the Old Testament and Philippians from the New Testament. But I want to give you a chart here that can show what this looks like. And let me just illustrate this a couple of different ways here. When it talks about Jesus, now, Paul lays out some critical pieces, but Paul is also early in his letter already set this up, because if we go back to the very beginning of Paul's letter to the Philippians, notice what Paul says about himself as he opens his letter. Paul writes, Paul and Timothy, slaves of Christ Jesus. Now, a lot of translations say servants, but that's kind of that misses something here. This is the Greek word douloi. Spelled in English is D-O-U-L-O-S. Or plural would be oi, like we have in the Greeks. This is servant or slaves. Again, critical, because if we're writing to the Philippians are Roman citizens, yet Paul uses the bottom of the status ladder. And let's look at this over here further, because this is going to be critical for understanding Philippians. In Roman culture, you have the gods, you have the emperor, you have Roman officials, you have senators, other officials, part of the leaders of the army and such. You're going to have Roman citizens. Again, these are all these persons are of high status. And then there's various levels, but then you get down to free persons. And then at the very bottom, you get the slaves. You get the douloi. So observe that. So Paul And this is the only, if you look at the way that Paul talks about himself in his other letters, he often calls himself a servant of Christ or a slave of Christ, but he usually also puts the title apostle there. So it's significant that Philippians is the only place where Paul introduces himself only as a slave. Well, let's set this up for a key point that Paul's going to make. The point that Paul's going to make using these examples is simply this. For missional reasons, he suggests this. The status that we embrace as followers of Jesus Christ sets the limits on our capacity to reach others with the gospel. The status we embrace sets the limits on our capacity to reach others with the gospel. So if we want to live by a high status, we're going to be missing something. So part of Paul's letter is he's writing to the Philippians to live for a different kind of citizenship. He wants them to be citizens of the gospel. So it's going to be a choice. So do we want to live by the rights, the privileges of Rome? Or do we want to live by the privileges of being a citizen of heaven, of the gospel? And we get that not by trying to raise ourselves up, but by intentionally embracing a low status as the platform for sharing the gospel with everyone. So, when Paul talks about Jesus, and a lot has been written on this middle section, but listen to the words now in this context. Who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used for his own advantage. So Jesus, though he obviously divine, doesn't count that as something to be used for his own advantage. So how did Jesus position himself? Verse 7, rather made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a slave, being found in human likeness, becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. That last little phrase, becoming obedient to death on a cross, is fascinating because if you're a Roman citizen, you would never be crucified. Crucifixion was reserved for the worst of the worst, persons who were rebels against Rome, or for slaves. So notice, part of Jesus fully not taking advantage of his status is embracing slavery. And Jesus demonstrates the extent to which he goes to that by dying on a cross, as what a powerful metaphor of how to subvert the Roman emperor's level of status. And then what happens? Notice what happens. And here's what we would call, and I jokingly call this Paul's prosperity gospel. But look what happens. Precisely because this is how Jesus lives, and this is the nature of what divinity really is, not holding on and taking advantage of, but giving. What happens there? Therefore, God super exalted Jesus. And what does it mean to be super exalted? So if Jesus is here, notice Jesus willingly goes here, God super exalts Jesus. And this is significant because now Jesus gets what? And this is where I want you to see what name above all names really means. Jesus gets the name above all names. And so all these things underneath here are qualitatively different. Jesus Christ is who? Jesus Christ is Lord. And not just Lord in the authoritarian sense. Jesus Christ is Lord in the sense of Jesus is the Yahweh of the Old Testament. It comes to this profound statement. The name above, because there is only one name that's above all names. And this is what's significant. Notice how this subverts the whole Roman system. It's not that Paul's denying that any of these things have any value to him, but what Paul's suggesting is that there is a name above all names, and everything else isn't actually worthy of the title God or worthy of any real status. So what Paul's saying is if we want to get status, we let God lift us up. Powerful. Then what does Paul go on to show? He talks about Timothy and Epaphroditus for what? Read those verses and look at what he says about them. For their focus on others. For Epaphroditus being so in for the gospel that he almost lost his life for the sake of the gospel, for his commitment to others. What does Paul do? Paul had status. Paul was a Roman citizen. Paul was a Jewish person of some reputation with learning in some key things. What does Paul do? Paul counts it all as loss, except for knowing Christ. And then Paul goes through this last little section, 3:17 through 21. Paul reaffirms this and says, now, brothers, be imitators of me. Be imitators of what? These folks are people that have represented the gospel to the Philippians. They have never met Jesus, but they know Timothy, Epaphroditus, and Paul. So Paul calls them to be imitators. And even notice the language there. Paul re-unpacks this. He says, imitate me and those who live like this. So Paul, co-workers. And then Paul talks about the cross of Christ. So notice Paul has talked about Jesus, his co-workers, and himself. Then he calls them to be imitators of Paul, co-workers, and Jesus, with the concluding part of standing firm. I've barely scratched the surface of what's going on here, but what I want you to see is when you look at how letters are structured, how books are structured in the Bible, you can get real insight into what they're saying. And I've brought out some real theological points simply by noticing recurring words, patterns here. So all of these patterns here invite us to make what? Comparisons. And why are we making these comparisons? Because these three model what it looks like to be a citizen worthy of the gospel of heaven. I'm Brian Russell. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, send them to me, and I will do my very best to answer them.